4:22 a.m. The Taiwan Strait. 6 months after the first crossing attempt, the Eastern Theater Command had spent 183 days studying the wreckage. Not literally, the disabled vessels from the first attempt had been towed back to Fujian ports and assessed by plan engineers whose reports ran to 4,400 pages. The engineering assessment was the easy part. What took longer, what consumed the true analytical resources of Eastern Theater Command's lessons learned process, was the sensor picture. Specifically, how had the United States known where each vessel was in real time through 800 feet of cloud ceiling and 2-kilometer visibility, and matched a weapon to each one within minutes of the crossing beginning? The answer, when it emerged from 6 months of analysis, was not the Aegis radar network. The Aegis ships had been doing what they always did, tracking surface contacts at range. The answer was the F-35C, specifically the EOTS system aboard the F-35C sorties that had been flying at 44,000 feet through the weather that had been chosen to obscure the crossing. The F-35C's infrared sensor could see through cloud cover that blocked conventional radar at sea-skimming altitudes. Every planned vessel had a heat signature: engines, crew, electronics. At 44,000 feet, in a clear air layer above the weather, the EOTS had read every vessel in the task force as clearly as if the sea had been glassy and calm. The lesson: the weather that had been chosen to conceal the crossing from human eyes had not concealed it from infrared sensors at altitude. The next crossing would need to address the sensor layer before the surface layer. The second solution: saturate the sensor before it can process. The F-35C's EOTS, like any infrared sensor, has a finite processing capacity. It can track a finite number of heat signatures simultaneously with targeting quality resolution. The number is classified. The Eastern Theater Command's engineers estimated it at between 200 and 400 targets in a single sensor frame. The first crossing had presented 81 surface contacts, well within the F-35C's processing envelope. The second attempt would present 2,000 contacts simultaneously, not vessels, drones. The Kaihong 7, CH-7, is a stealthy, unmanned combat aerial vehicle with a 22-meter wingspan and an infrared signature comparable to a small manned aircraft. The plan had 340 of them distributed across bases in Fujian and Zhejiang. Each carries 4 anti-ship munitions, modified air-launched torpedoes capable of penetrating a vessel's hull below the waterline. In the 6 months since the first crossing, Eastern Theater Command had developed a new operational concept: launch 340 CH-7 drones over the strait in a synchronized wave, mixed with 1,700 smaller Shahed-equivalent loitering munitions, creating a sensor picture of 2,000-plus simultaneous airborne contacts over a 180-kilometer front. The F-35Cs would have to choose which contacts to engage. The contacts they did not engage would reach the surface. Below the drone saturation layer, a second-generation crossing force. Not the surface-heavy amphibious fleet of the first attempt. A dispersed, low-observable force, 34 Type 726 LCAC hovercraft, carrying Marines at 40 knots. Their approach compressed into a 90-minute crossing window, interspersed with 200 decoy surface contacts from expendable unmanned surface vessels, whose radar returns were designed to be indistinguishable from loaded landing craft at the resolution of a shipborne search radar. 234 contacts, 34 real, 200 decoys, against a radar picture already overwhelmed by 2,000 airborne contacts. The plan had spent 183 days building a crossing architecture designed specifically to defeat the system that had defeated them. At 4:22 a.m., the CH-7 launches began. From 6 bases in Fujian and Zhejiang, 340 CH-7 stealthy drones launched in a 6-minute window. Simultaneously, 1,700 Kaihong 10 loitering munitions launched from ground sites along the coast. Smaller, faster, non-stealthy, designed to present maximum infrared signature rather than minimum. The CH-7S were designed to survive. The CH-10s were designed to overwhelm. Together, 2,040 airborne contacts over the strait in the same window. 1 minute and 40 seconds after the first CH-7 launch, the 34 Type 726A LCAC hovercraft began their crossing run from 3 beaches in Fujian province. At 40 knots over a 90-kilometer crossing distance, 135 minutes to Taiwan's western coast. The 200 unmanned decoy surface vessels launched simultaneously, their radar returns calibrated to LCAC equivalent cross-sections. From the SBIRS satellite, the drone launches registered as a mass of thermal signatures across the Fujian coast, not ballistic missiles, but the slower ignition signature of jet turbines in hundreds of small aircraft. The processing algorithm classified the event in 4.1 seconds. Mass drone launch / Taiwan Strait / count exceeds 2,000/surface movement detected simultaneously. The SBIRS alert reached Indopacom at 4:23 a.m. The E-2D Hawkeye on patrol reached its first assessment at 4:24 a.m. The drone's saturation architecture was immediately recognizable to the crew. Not because they had seen it before. No one had. Because they had been briefed on it. Eastern Theater Command's lessons learned analysis had been partially compromised 9 weeks earlier, when a signals intelligence intercept captured a planning conference transmission that described the saturation concept in sufficient detail for Indopacom's analysts to reconstruct the operational architecture. The intercept had been assessed as 70% reliable. The E-2D crew had read the assessment. The 70% had become 100% at 4:22 a.m. Indopacom activated Operation Seawall Alpha at 4:24 a.m., the updated crossing response plan that had been developed in the 6 months since the first attempt, specifically incorporating the lessons of the first engagement and the intelligence about the saturation concept. Seawall Alpha had 4 elements the original Seawall had not included. Element 1, EA-18G Growler Saturation Response. 8 growlers pre-positioned at Okinawa and aboard USS Carl Vinson, launched at 4:26 a.m. Their mission was not radar jamming in the conventional sense. It was GPS denial, generating a GPS spoofing field over the Taiwan Strait that would degrade the CH-7's navigation system by feeding false position data. The CH-7's terrain-following navigation relied on GPS-assisted waypoint guidance. Spoofed GPS meant waypoints that existed on the drone's map, but not in the physical world. The CH-7's attack profile, requiring GPS accuracy to within 10 meters to engage a moving vessel, would degrade to unusable at the spoofing levels the 8 growlers could generate simultaneously. The CH-10 loitering munitions were simpler. They used infrared terminal guidance, not GPS. The growler spoofing would not affect them. They were the problem that the second element addressed. Element 2, the Vampire CRAM extended network. In the 6 months since the first crossing attempt, the U.S. had deployed 24 Vampire, vehicle-agnostic munitions pods, systems on Taiwanese positions along the western coast, each capable of engaging 16 targets simultaneously with laser-guided 70mm rockets. A total of 384 simultaneous engagement channels covering the western coastal corridor that any crossing force would have to traverse in its final 40 kilometers. The CH-10 loitering munitions, in their terminal approach to surface targets, presented exactly the engagement geometry that Vampire was designed for. Slow, low altitude, predictable terminal approach vectors. The Vampire deployment had been negotiated with Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense over 4 months. A politically sensitive process because it required stationing U.S. military equipment on Taiwan's soil in a configuration that went beyond the arms sales framework that had governed U.S.-Taiwan defense cooperation for decades. The negotiation had concluded 3 months before the second crossing attempt. The 24 systems had been positioned, integrated into Taiwan's coastal defense network, and their crews trained on joint operational procedures. The training had involved 340 hours of combined exercises between U.S. and Taiwanese operators. The CH-10 loitering munitions that arrived over Taiwan's western coast at 4:47 a.m. found a defense that had not existed 6 months earlier. The 24 Vampire systems opened fire simultaneously. The engagement rate: 384 targets in the first processing cycle, 384 more in the second, a third cycle beginning before the second was complete. The system's 70mm laser-guided rockets had a minimum effective range of 80 meters and a maximum of 1,400 meters, a band precisely calibrated for the CH-10's terminal approach geometry. The Taiwanese operators on 3 of the Vampire systems had been in their positions for 11 hours when the crossing began. They had been at full readiness since the SBIR's alert at 4:23 a.m. When the CH-10 wave entered their engagement sectors at 4:47 a.m., none of them had slept in 14 hours. None of them showed it in their engagement data. Their processing rates were within 4% of the system's theoretical maximum throughout the engagement. Element 3, the updated F-35C sensor protocol. Indopacom's engineers had spent 6 months developing a processing filter for the EOTS that distinguished CH-7 stealthy drone signatures from LCAC surface contact signatures at range, using a multispectral comparison that the CH-7 stealth design had not accounted for. The filter was not perfect. It would fail to distinguish approximately 15% of CH-7 signatures from background, but it reduced the sensor overload problem from 2,040 contacts to approximately 300 requiring individual assessment. Element 4, pre-positioned LRASM salvos. In the 183 days between the first crossing and this one, 340 LRASM rounds had been preloaded on USS Carl Vinson strike aircraft, on USS Theodore Roosevelt strike aircraft, and on 4 B-1B Lancers at Andersen Air Force Base. The LRASM's autonomous target recognition system could distinguish a loaded LCAC from an unmanned decoy surface vessel by analyzing the thermal profile of crew heat signatures, engine output, and structural weight distribution, all of which differed between a manned 160-ton hovercraft at full combat load and an expendable decoy unit. The decoy discrimination rate in testing, 91%. At 4:31 a.m., 9 minutes after the first CH-7 launch, the EA-18G Growler GPS spoofing field came online over the strait. The effect on the CH-7 force was not immediate. The CH-7's navigation system had a 4-second GPS averaging algorithm designed to filter spurious signals. The Growler spoofing exceeded the filter's tolerance within 11 seconds of full power operation. By 4:32 a.m., the 340 CH-7S were navigating on false position data. The false position data did not send them into the sea. It sent them off their assigned approach vectors. A CH-7 assigned to attack USS Carl Vinson at bearing 087 degrees began steering toward bearing 071 degrees. A CH-7 assigned to attack a carrier screen destroyer at bearing 094 degrees began steering toward bearing 108 degrees. The attack formation began spreading laterally, its precise coordination degrading into a dispersed cloud of aircraft flying in approximately the right direction, but no longer on the targeting solutions required to engage specific vessels. Of 340 CH-7s, 312 lost coherent attack profiles within 90 seconds of Growler activation. 28 had already committed to terminal attack profiles before the spoofing took effect. Their terminal guidance had switched from GPS to autonomous infrared before the spoofing field reached full power. The 28 committed CH-7S continued on their attack profiles. F-35C sorties engaged 19 of the 28 with AIM-120D at beyond visual range. The remaining 9 entered defensive engagement range of the carrier screen. CRAM from USS Bunker Hill intercepted 4. CIWS intercepted 3. 2 reached their targets. 1 impacted the destroyer USS John Paul Jones above the waterline on her starboard bow. The other impacted a section of USS Carl Vinson's deck edge elevator housing. Both hits caused structural damage. USS John Paul Jones sustained more significant damage. The impact penetrated the bow compartment. Flooding was controlled by damage control within 19 minutes. The ship remained operational at reduced speed. USS Carl Vinson's elevator housing damage was assessed as repairable within 48 hours. Flight operations were not interrupted. The 1,700 CH-10 loitering munitions presented a different picture. Without GPS navigation, they continued on their programmed infrared-guided profiles. Slower, less capable, but functional. The Vampire network along Taiwan's western coast engaged the CH-10s beginning at 4:47 a.m. as the leading edge of the saturation wave entered terminal approach range. The 384 engagement channels processed targets at a rate that the CH-10 wave volume exceeded by a factor of 3.4. More targets than Vampire could engage simultaneously. The overflow. SM-2 from Taiwanese Key Lung-class destroyers, AIM-120D from F-16V sorties launched from Tainan at 4:29 a.m., and Phalanx CIWS aboard every vessel within range. Of 1,700 CH-10 munitions, 1,247 intercepted by layered defense before reaching terminal approach geometry. 453 entered terminal approach to surface targets. Of those, 281 were engaged by Vampire, 112 by SM, 2 in AIM-120D, 60 reached within Phalanx range. Phalanx engaged 47 of 60, 13 impacted surface targets, 9 decoy unmanned surface vessels, 3 Taiwanese Coast Guard vessels that had not fully completed their dispersal from the contested corridor, 1 U.S. destroyer. USS Milius sustained 1 CH-10 impact on her aft superstructure, significant damage to the communications antenna array and the aft 5-inch gun mount. No penetration to the hull. The ship remained fully operational. This was the plan's best result. 2 U.S. ships damaged. 1 Taiwanese destroyer damaged from a different CH-10 impact. Actual damage to operational military capability. All 3 vessels remained combat effective. The CH-7 saturation concept had partially worked. 2 CH-7 hits on U.S. assets, and had mostly failed due to GPS spoofing it had not been designed to counter. The surface crossing force had not fared better. The F-35C filter had distinguished 34 genuine LCAC from 200 decoys with 91% accuracy. 31 of 34 LCAC identified correctly within 8 minutes of their launch. The 3 that were initially assessed as decoys were reclassified within 14 minutes when their speed and wake pattern diverged from the decoy unit's programmed behavior. All 34 LCAC were confirmed and tracked by 4:38 a.m. The pre-positioned LRASM salvos launched at 4:41 a.m. 272 rounds from USS Carl Vinson, USS Theodore Roosevelt, and 4 B-1B Lancers, all assigned to confirmed LCAC targets. Each LCAC received a minimum of 8 LRASM rounds allocated, accounting for defense suppression and mechanical failures. The LCAC's speed, 40 knots, made them faster targets than the Type 071 LPDs from the first crossing, but also more fragile. A 160-ton aluminum hovercraft that loses its air cushion at sea does not maintain 40 knots. It stops. Of 34 LCAC, 29 were rendered non-operational by LRASM impacts between 4:51 and 5:07 a.m. 5 survived the first LRASM wave by executing maximum speed evasive maneuvers that placed them temporarily in the radar shadow of disabled decoy vessels. All 5 were acquired by F-35 CEOTS within 4 minutes of losing LRASM cover, and were assigned Second Wave Harpoon Block 2+ from USS Carl Vinson's remaining strike sorties. Final LCAC non-operational assessment, 34 of 34 by 5:19 a.m. No LCAC reached Taiwan's territorial waters. Of 200 decoy unmanned surface vessels, 9 received LRASM or harpoon impacts from misidentification before the filter discrimination was complete. The remaining 191 were confirmed as decoys and not engaged. At 5:11 a.m., Eastern Theater Command's command relay for the crossing operation went offline. The same Tomahawk package targeting methodology from Seawall, now refined and faster. The first Tomahawks had launched at 4:34 a.m. By 5:11 a.m., 4 of 6 primary relay nodes for the crossing force were non-functional. The CH-7S still airborne, 312 of them flying on false GPS data, were now receiving no updated orders and no corrected navigation inputs. They continued flying on their corrupted trajectories. 287 exhausted their fuel over the strait and descended into the water. 25 turned back toward Fujian on their last confirmed waypoint. The desperation gambit came at 5:03 a.m., while the surface crossing was still being processed. Eastern Theater Command launched 41 DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missiles from reserve TEL vehicles in Fujian province, targeting both carrier groups. USS Carl Vinson and USS Theodore Roosevelt had been repositioning throughout the engagement. The DF-21D targeting solutions were based on their last confirmed positions, 28 and 34 kilometers stale, respectively. SM-3 Block 2A from both carrier groups and THAAD from Okinawa engaged the salvo. 37 of 41 intercepted in mid-course, 4 entered terminal seeker phase. 2 acquired the repositioned carriers, both engaged by SM-6. 2 impacted the ocean at their programmed coordinates, finding empty water. At 5:31 a.m., the last coordinated Eastern Theater Command transmission relating to the crossing operation was intercepted. It was not an operational order. It was a request for status from surviving relay nodes. The surviving relay nodes, 2 of 6, transmitted back partial engagement assessments. Crossing force non-operational, drone saturation results below threshold. DF-21, D second salvo, not recommended. Eastern Theater Command received the assessment. It did not transmit a response. The silence was not the defeat. The defeat had happened at 4:51 a.m. when the first LRASM reached the first LCAC. The silence was the acknowledgement. From the first CH-7 launch at 4:22 a.m. to the last Eastern Theater Command transmission at 5:31 a.m., 1 hour and 9 minutes. CH-7 stealthy drones launched, 340. Rendered non-operational by GPS spoofing and air intercept, 319. Reached terminal attack phase, 28. Intercepted, 19. Impacted U.S. assets 2. USS John Paul Jones bow section, USS Carl Vinson elevator housing. CH-10 loitering munitions launched, 1,700. Intercepted by layered defense, 1,687. Surface impacts on military targets, 3. 1 U.S. destroyer, 1 Taiwanese destroyer, 1 Taiwanese Coast Guard vessel. All 3 remained operational. LCAC crossing force 34 launched, 34 non-operational by 5:19 a.m. None reached Taiwan territorial waters. Decoy discrimination. 31 of 34 correctly identified within 8 minutes. All 34 confirmed within 14 minutes. DF-21. D second salvo, 41 launched. 39 intercepted or missed repositioned targets. 0 carrier impacts. U.S. vessels with structural damage. USS John Paul Jones, bow compartment, operational at reduced speed. USS Milius, aft superstructure fully operational. USS Carl Vinson, elevator housing damage, flight operations uninterrupted. The second crossing had cost Eastern Theater Command more than the first. In drones, in LCAC, in missiles, in the relay nodes that the Tomahawk packages had eliminated, and it had produced less. No LCAC reached the beach. The carrier groups were intact. Taiwan's coast defense was intact, and 3 of the 4 lessons learned adaptations had been anticipated and countered. The one adaptation that had partially worked, the CH-7 GPS spoofing vulnerability, had not been fully anticipated, had produced 2 hits on U.S. assets before the Growlers suppressed it. Those 2 hits would drive the next iteration of the CH-7's navigation architecture. Eastern Theater Command's engineers were already noting it. 183 days for the second attempt. The third attempt would take longer. The architecture that had stopped it would be harder to defeat next time, because the next time, the U.S. would know what the second attempt had tried, and what the U.S. knows it prepares for. The F-35Cs recovered aboard USS Carl Vinson at 6:14 a.m. The elevator housing repair crew was already at work on the damage. The estimate, 31 hours to full operational status. The carrier continued into the wind. Aircraft were still launching. The machine had held again, and it was already running the analysis on what would be different the third time.